July 2, 1941, Kummersdorf Proving Grounds, 25 kilometers south of Berlin. The pencil in Oberingenieur Wolfgang Fischer's hand stopped moving mid-calculation. For the third time that morning, he rechecked his measurements of the armor plate thickness. The numbers defied everything German engineering doctrine had taught him over 2 decades of designing military vehicles. The Soviet T-34's frontal armor, sloped at 60 degrees from vertical, provided an effective thickness of 90 millimeters while using only 45 millimeters of actual steel. German tanks achieved similar protection only with 80 millimeters of vertical armor, nearly twice the weight. Fischer set down his calipers and stared at the captured Soviet tank, its green camouflage still bearing the scars of battle from the fighting near Grodno 8 days earlier. The T-34 had arrived at Kummersdorf after being captured intact on June 24th, one of the first specimens taken during Operation Barbarossa's opening days. Now, Germany's finest engineers swarmed over it like archaeologists discovering an impossible artifact. What they found would shatter their assumptions about German technical superiority and trigger a crisis of confidence that would reshape the entire German tank program. Fischer stepped back from the T-34's glacis plate, his mind racing through the implications. The sloped armor wasn't just deflecting projectiles, it was mathematically multiplying the effective protection without adding proportional weight. He called over his assistant, Heinrich Kniepkamp from the Army Weapons Department. "Look at this," Fischer said, running his hand along the 60-degree angle. "At this slope, when our 50mm Pak-38 fires at perpendicular range, the shell encounters what is effectively 90 millimeters of armor, not 45. Kniepkamp examined the measurements himself, then pulled out the standardized penetration tables for German anti-tank weapons. The 37mm Pak-36, the Wehrmacht standard anti-tank gun, could penetrate only 29 millimeters of 30-degree sloped armor at 500 meters. Against the T-34's 60-degree slope, it was nearly useless. Even more disturbing was the comparison with German tanks. The Panzer III, Germany's primary medium tank, mounted 30 millimeters of vertical armor on its frontal plate. The Panzer IV had 50 millimeters, also vertical. Both designs now appeared hopelessly obsolete. "Perhaps this is a prototype," Kniepkamp suggested, his voice uncertain. "Special armor for parade vehicles or command tanks?" Fischer shook his head. The welding patterns, the manufacturing marks, the wear on the tracks, everything indicated this was a standard production model. If the Soviets were building these in quantity, the Wehrmacht faced a problem far greater than anyone in Berlin had imagined. The T-34's armor wasn't just thicker, it was fundamentally more efficient. German doctrine had always prioritized vertical armor for easier manufacturing and interior space. The Soviets had sacrificed crew comfort for battlefield survivability, and the mathematics proved them correct. The examination team moved to the T-34's main armament, a 76.2mm F-34 gun. Dr. Erwin Aders from Daimler-Benz measured the barrel length, 41.5 calibers, giving a muzzle velocity of 662 meters per second with armor-piercing ammunition. Fischer consulted his notes on German tank guns. The Panzer III's 50mm KWK-38 could penetrate 61 millimeters of vertical armor at 500 meters. The T-34's gun could penetrate 69 millimeters at the same range, and it fired a shell with significantly more explosive content. "The Panzer IV's short 75mm gun?" Aders asked, already knowing the answer. "Worse," Fischer replied. "It's a low-velocity howitzer designed for infantry support, not anti-tank work. Maximum penetration is 43 millimeters at 500 meters. The engineers examined the T-34's suspension system next. The Christie suspension that provided remarkable cross-country mobility. Large road wheels, wide tracks distributing ground pressure over 0.62 kilograms per square centimeter. The Panzer III, by comparison, had 0.96 kilograms per square centimeter, nearly 50% more ground pressure, meaning worse performance in mud and snow. Then they discovered the diesel engine, a V234 producing 500 horsepower. German tanks used gasoline engines. The Maybach HL-120 in the Panzer III and IV produced 300 horsepower. The T-34 had a power-to-weight ratio of 18.2 horsepower per ton. The Panzer III managed only 14.4. Professor Ferdinand Porsche arrived at Kummersdorf on July 5th, summoned urgently from his competing heavy tank project. He spent 3 hours examining the T-34 in silence, making notes, measuring, calculating. Finally, he spoke to the assembled engineers. "Gentlemen, the Russians have achieved what we attempted and failed. This vehicle combines firepower, protection, and mobility without compromising any single element. There were no trade-offs. German tank design philosophy assumed you had to sacrifice one element to gain another. More armor meant less speed, bigger guns meant less reliability. The T-34 rejected that assumption entirely." Before we continue with what the German engineers discovered next, I want to hear from you. What's the most surprising WWII technology you've learned about? Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. And if you're finding this technical analysis fascinating, hit that like button. It helps more history enthusiasts discover these stories. On July 8th, the team began detailed metallurgical analysis of the T-34's armor. What they discovered challenged everything they thought they knew about Soviet industrial capacity. The armor wasn't homogeneous steel. The Soviets used different alloys for different sections: manganese, silicon, molybdenum steels for thinner rolled sections, chromium molybdenum steels for thicker plates, and complex manganese silicon nickel chromium molybdenum alloys for cast components. Each alloy was optimized for its specific application, something German engineers had attempted but never successfully implemented in mass production. The armor was also heat-treated to maximum hardness. This made it extremely resistant to penetration, but also brittle. High-explosive shells could cause internal spalling that killed the crew even without penetrating. It was a calculated trade-off. Protection against armor-piercing shells was prioritized over protection against high-explosive fragmentation. Fischer reviewed Germany's own attempts at sloped armor design. The VK-20 project, begun in 1938, had proposed incorporating sloped plates. The engineers had struggled with 4 critical problems: manufacturing complexity, interior space reduction, weak points at angle transitions, and difficulty mounting components on non-vertical surfaces. The T-34 had solved all 4 problems. The manufacturing used simple large castings for the turret and welded plates for the hull, easier than German small plate construction. Interior space was maintained by increasing overall hull size. Angle transitions were minimized through bold design choices. Components were redesigned to fit the sloped geometry rather than forcing the geometry to fit existing components. Most disturbing was the production implication. The T-34's design was actually simpler to manufacture than German tanks. Fewer welds, larger components, looser tolerances that didn't compromise combat effectiveness. While German factories obsessed over precision fits and interchangeable parts, Soviet factories had optimized for rapid mass production. "We cannot replicate this," Ada said quietly, staring at the sectioned armor plate. "Not quickly. Our factories are tooled for vertical armor. Re-engineering everything would take 18 months minimum, and we don't have the diesel engine production capacity." The tactical implications hit Fischer like a physical blow. Every T-34 on the Eastern Front was effectively invulnerable to standard German anti-tank weapons beyond 100 meters frontally. German tank crews would need to maneuver for flank shots or wait for the few 88mm anti-aircraft guns to engage. Meanwhile, the T-34 could penetrate any German tank from the front at combat ranges. On July 15th, Fischer received intelligence reports from Army Group Center about T-34 sightings. The numbers made him sit down heavily at his desk. The first report documented 114 T-34s engaged by the 18th Panzer Division near Lapel between June 24th and July 10th. The second report from the 7th Panzer Division listed encounters with 87 T-34s in the Minsk sector. A third report from the 12th Panzer Division, 93 T-34s encountered near Orsha. Fischer did the arithmetic. 3 divisions, 3 separate sectors, nearly 300 T-34s in less than 3 weeks of fighting. And those were just the tanks those divisions had encountered. Not destroyed, not captured, simply encountered in combat. Intelligence estimates became more detailed over the following weeks. By July 22nd, Fremde Heere Ost, Foreign Armies East, concluded that the Red Army had deployed approximately 967 T-34 tanks at the start of Operation Barbarossa. They were concentrated in 5 mechanized corps, the 4th, 6th, 8th, 15th, and elements of the 3rd. The 6th Mechanized Corps alone had 452 new tanks, 238 T-34s, and 214 KV heavy tanks. The 4th Mechanized Corps had 414 new tanks. These formations had more modern tanks than entire German panzer groups. Fischer compared German production figures. In 1941, Germany would produce approximately 3,790 tanks total, including Panzer II light tanks and Czech-built Panzer 38 TEs. Soviet T-34 production in 1941 was estimated at 3,016 units. The Soviets were producing nearly as many T-34s alone as Germany was producing tanks of all types. Then came the production projections. Soviet tank factories at Stalingrad, Kharkov, and the new facilities being established beyond the Urals had combined capacity exceeding 1,200 tanks per month. German capacity was approximately 316 tanks per month across all models. The ratio was nearly 4.1 in Soviet favor, and every Soviet tank being produced was superior to its German counterpart. Fischer obtained aluminum production statistics. The Soviet Union produced 85,000 tons of aluminum in 1941. Germany produced 233,000 tons. Soviet advantage in raw material wasn't the problem. German advantage in raw materials wasn't helping. Steel production. Soviet Union, 17.9 million tons in 1941. Germany, 20.9 million tons. Again, relatively close. The difference was in application of resources. Soviet industry had concentrated on producing fewer types of weapons in much larger quantities. Germany's industry produced dozens of different models, each requiring unique tooling, training, and spare parts logistics. By August 1941, revised intelligence estimates projected Soviet T-34 production would reach 5,000 units by year's end. German production of comparable medium tanks, the long-barreled Panzer IV, wouldn't begin until March 1942, and initial production would be measured in dozens per month, not hundreds. Fischer stared at the spreadsheet, the numbers swimming before his eyes. The Wehrmacht had invaded the Soviet Union with 3,166 tanks, of which only 1,146 mounted guns capable of potentially penetrating a T-34. The Soviets had started with 967 T-34s and were producing them 4 times faster than Germany could produce comparable vehicles. "We're already behind," he said to the empty office, "and the gap is widening every day." The numbers Wolfgang Fischer was seeing were staggering, and they painted an undeniable picture. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the industrial side of WWII, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. We release new technical analysis videos every week, and drop a comment. What aspect of WWII history fascinates you most? The technology? The strategy? The human stories? I read every comment. Fischer spent 3 days drafting his official report, dated July 22, 1941. He knew what Berlin wanted to hear. Reassurance that German technical superiority remained intact, that the T-34 was a fluke, that existing weapons could handle the threat. He wrote the truth instead. The T-34 represents the most significant advancement in tank design since the introduction of the tank itself, Fischer's report began. Its combination of sloped armor, powerful armament, high mobility, and manufacturing simplicity makes it superior to any tank currently in German service. He detailed the technical specifications, the comparison tests, the metallurgical analysis. Then came the conclusion that would doom the report to official neglect. Our current Panzer III and short-barreled Panzer IV are obsolete in the face of this threat. The 37mm and 50mm anti-tank guns cannot reliably penetrate T-34 frontal armor beyond 100 meters. Only the 88mm flak gun provides reliable long-range penetration, and we have insufficient numbers deployed with forward units. His recommendations were stark: immediate development of a new medium tank incorporating sloped armor and a long-barreled 75mm gun, emergency production of additional 88mm anti-tank weapons, and tactical doctrine changes emphasizing flanking maneuvers rather than frontal engagement. Heinrich Kniepkamp reviewed the draft, his face grave. "Wolfgang, this will not be well received. You're essentially telling the High Command that we've lost the technical advantage before the campaign is 4 weeks old. Should I lie? Fischer asked. No, Kniepkamp sighed, but understand that they will likely dismiss this as defeatism or exaggeration. The report went up the chain of command through the Army Weapons Department to the Chief of Army Equipment and Commander of the Replacement Army, General Friedrich Fromm. From there to the Army High Command, OKH, and ultimately to Hitler's headquarters. The response came 3 weeks later. The report was filed as Technical Assessment for Future Consideration. No immediate action was ordered. No emergency development program was initiated. The assessment was marked with a notation questioning whether the examined T-34 was truly representative of Soviet production models or a specially prepared prestige vehicle. At a meeting on August 18th, Fischer confronted his superior officer about the lack of response. Sir, the frontline reports confirm everything in my assessment. The T-34 is not rare. It's standard equipment in Soviet mechanized corps. The officer's response was blunt. Engineer Fischer, your technical competence is not in question. However, the Führer has made clear that any suggestion of Soviet technical superiority undermines national morale and constitutes defeatist propaganda. Your report contradicts his assessment that Slavic peoples are incapable of producing weapons equal to German engineering. Ideology had overruled objective analysis. The report joined dozens of similar assessments from frontline commanders in archive files, unread by decision-makers who preferred reassuring myths to uncomfortable truths. October 4th, 1941. 3 months after Fischer's report disappeared into bureaucratic limbo, the 4th Panzer Division suffered a devastating defeat at Mtsensk, near Oryol. General Heinz Guderian's Panzer Group II encountered well-handled T-34s that used their superior mobility to flank German positions, their superior armor to shrug off return fire, and their superior guns to destroy German tanks before they could effectively respond. Guderian immediately demanded an inquiry into the realities of tank warfare on the Eastern Front. His recommendation was radical: produce a direct copy of the T-34. On November 20th, 1941, 5 months after Fischer's examination, a special Panzer Commission arrived at the Eastern Front to assess the T-34 threat. They reached the same conclusions Fischer had documented in July. The T-34 was superior, German tanks were obsolete, immediate action was required. By then, Soviet production had accelerated. In 1941, 3,016 T-34s were manufactured. In 1942, that number would rise to 12,520. By 1943, production reached 15,700 units, 1,300 tanks per month, 43 tanks per day. German attempts to counter the T-34 came too late and in insufficient numbers. The long-barreled Panzer IV with the 75mm KWK-40 gun entered production in March 1942, 9 months after Fischer's warnings. In 1942, Germany produced 994 Panzer IV tanks of all variants, only 887 with the long barrel. The Soviets produced 12,520 T-34s the same year, a ratio of 14.1. The Panther tank, Germany's answer incorporating sloped armor copied from the T-34, didn't enter production until January 1943, 18 months after Fischer's examination at Kummersdorf. When it finally reached combat at Kursk in July 1943, mechanical problems plagued the rushed design. By then, the Soviets had produced over 30,000 T-34s. Fischer received copies of field reports throughout 1942, documenting T-34 losses by weapon type. A Soviet study analyzing T-34 casualties from June 1941 to September 1942 showed that 54.3% were destroyed by the long-barreled 50mm KWK-39 gun, the upgunned Panzer III that didn't enter widespread service until mid-1942. Another 10.1% fell to 75mm guns. Only 3.4% were destroyed by the vaunted 88mm gun. The statistics validated Fischer's analysis. German weapons could destroy T-34s, but only at close range or from flanking positions, exactly what his report had stated. The difference was that by 1942, German crews had learned through bitter experience what Fischer had tried to tell them in July 1941. But experience came at a cost, measured in thousands of destroyed German tanks and tens of thousands of casualties. Every month of delay in responding to Fischer's warnings had allowed the production gap to widen further. After the war, when Soviet and German archives were opened to researchers, the full scale of T-34 production became clear. Between 1940 and 1945, Soviet factories produced 84,070 T-34 tanks, 35,020 with 76mm guns, and 48,950 as the upgraded T-34-85. It was the most produced tank of World War II and the second most produced tank in history. Germany's total production of Panzer III and I-4 medium tanks from 1940 to 1945, approximately 24,000 units combined. The T-34 alone outnumbered German medium tank production by more than 3.1. Wolfgang Fischer survived the war and was interrogated by Soviet technical intelligence officers in May 1945. They asked him about his July 1941 examination of the T-34 at Kummersdorf. "What did you recommend?" the Soviet colonel asked. "I recommended immediate development of a comparable vehicle and emergency production of heavy anti-tank weapons," Fischer replied. "I stated that our current tanks were obsolete." "And what was done?" Fischer's laugh was bitter. "Nothing, for 5 months. Then panic, redesigns, delays. By the time our response entered production, you had produced 30,000 T-34s. The Soviet officer nodded and produced a document from his briefcase, Fischer's original July 22, 1941 report, captured from German Army archives. Stamped across the cover page in red ink, "Filed for future consideration. No immediate action required." "You were correct about everything," the Soviet officer said. "The specifications, the production numbers, the tactical implications, all of it." "I know," Fischer said quietly. The declassified Soviet production records showed that Fischer's August 1941 projection of 5,000 T-34s by year's end was actually conservative. The actual number was 3,016, but that was despite massive factory evacuations ahead of the German advance. In 1942, with factories re-established beyond the Urals, production exceeded 12,500. German intelligence had identified other engineers and officers who reached similar conclusions and were similarly ignored. Major General Friedrich von Mellenthin, Chief of Staff of Exl-48 Panzer Corps, who stated simply, "We had nothing comparable." Colonel General Heinz Guderian, who warned of tank panic among German troops facing T-34s. Dozens of frontline commanders who filed reports documenting their anti-tank weapons' ineffectiveness. All were dismissed as defeatist or exaggerating. All were proven correct by mathematics that could not be argued with. Production numbers, loss ratios, penetration tables, armor thickness measurements. The historical record proved Wolfgang Fischer right in every detail. If this kind of detailed technical history interests you, you'll love our other videos analyzing WWII equipment and strategy. Check out the playlist in the description. And before we wrap up with the bigger lesson here, hit that like button if you appreciate this level of research and detail in history content. The story of Wolfgang Fischer and the T-34 examination at Kummersdorf is a microcosm of how ideology blinds institutions to objective reality. Fischer's report contained no opinions, only measurements. Armor thickness in millimeters, gun calibers, penetration ranges, production estimates. These were facts that could be verified by anyone with calipers and calculators, yet the report was dismissed because its conclusions contradicted fundamental Nazi ideology about Slavic racial inferiority. The proposition that Soviet engineers could design a tank superior to German engineering was literally unthinkable within that ideological framework. Therefore, the evidence had to be wrong, or exaggerated, or based on examining an unrepresentative prototype. This pattern repeated across multiple domains. Germany's intelligence services correctly identified Soviet industrial capacity, correctly estimated tank production numbers, correctly assessed the combat effectiveness of Soviet equipment, and were systematically ignored when their findings contradicted ideological assumptions. Other examples from the same conflict illustrate the same mechanism. German dismissal of American industrial capacity projections, rejection of warnings about Soviet strategic reserves, disbelief in Soviet force generation capabilities. In each case, competent analysts provided accurate assessments that were rejected by decision-makers who could not reconcile the data with their worldview. The cost of this institutional denial was measured in years and lives. The 5-month delay between Fischer's July 1941 report and the November 1941 Panzer Commission allowed Soviet T-34 production to add approximately 2,000 additional tanks to Red Army inventories. The additional year, until long-barreled Panzer IVs entered mass production, allowed another 12,000 T-34s to be built. By the time the Panther tank, incorporating the sloped armor Fischer had documented, reached combat, the Soviets had produced over 30,000 T-34s. Mathematical reality does not negotiate with ideology. The T-34's sloped armor multiplied effective thickness, whether German doctrine acknowledged it or not. Soviet factories produced 1,300 tanks per month in 1943, regardless of Nazi assumptions about Slavic industrial capacity. The penetration tables showing German anti-tank weapons' ineffectiveness were derived from physics, not propaganda. In the end, Fischer's July 1941 examination of that single captured T-34 at Kummersdorf told the story of the entire war. One side built their strategy on objective analysis of capabilities and constraints. The other built theirs on ideological assumptions that reality refused to accommodate. The gap between those two approaches was measured in 84,070 T-34s and the ultimate outcome of the war itself. Thanks for watching this deep dive into one of WWII's most significant technical revelations. If you found Wolfgang Fischer's story as fascinating as I did researching it, there's another incredible story waiting for you on screen right now. Click on that video to discover another moment when captured technology changed everything. I'll see you there, and remember, history isn't just about the battles, it's about the moments when reality forced even the most confident nations to confront uncomfortable truths. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep exploring the stories that shaped our world.